Good evening. Welcome to Ridge Vineyards' first ever virtual consumer tasting. My name is David Amadia. We're coming to you live this evening from Montebello Mountain. I'm joined this evening by Paul Draper, our head winemaker, and Eric Bauer, our Montebello winemaker. And we will be tasting with you this evening 9 different wines. 7 of these wines you actually have available to you, and 2 are still in barrel. Yeah. So we will be fielding your questions this evening, so feel free to use the chat function on live stream to submit your questions, or if you prefer, you can also email questions to us at wine@ridgewine.com. So the first 3 wines we're going to taste this evening are from our ATP program. And before we jump right into the wines, I just wanted to take a moment to talk about the ATP program and the fact that we're celebrating the 35th anniversary of this wine club. And based upon our research, and it's hard to go back that far in time on these type of issues, but we believe this is probably the very first wine club in the United States that was developed. So just wanted to ask Paul about the early days of the ATP and how the concept was developed, and what was the inspiration behind it?
Well, because, of course, starting way back when with just Montebello and then expanding into Zinfandel with things like Geyserville and then Lytton Springs, we also worked in some of the vineyards with different varieties, and also a number of small vineyards that were so tiny, typically 19th century remnant vineyards, Zinfandel vineyards, and the quantities coming out of them were so small that there was no way we could distribute these nationally or even in the state of California. And so we said, okay, what are we going to do? We're up in this mountain, and yes, we get people visiting us. In those days, we're open 1 day a week. So let's figure out a way to offer them directly to consumers. And that should take care of these tiny quantities. And it's grown from there. The quantities are still limited, but and only a few of the vineyards. Well, we've got a couple tonight. Mm-hmm. Actually, all 3 tonight are vineyards that we farm. And that wasn't necessarily true in the past, that many of the ATP vineyards were outside vineyards where we were buying the grapes. But the case tonight is all 3 we actually farm.
Well, it was quite an inspiration. Here we are 35 years later, and I don't know of a single winery who doesn't have a wine club today. So
that's probably true.
It was certainly a well-founded concept, that's for sure. So the 3 wines we're going to start out with from the ATP program are the 06 Grenache from the Lytton Estate, then the 07 Lytton Estate Syrah, and the 09 Zinfandel for the Old School. So why don't we jump right in and start with this 06 Grenache?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll say a couple of words. We were tasting just a few weeks ago with an old friend who has a great blog and is a great fan of the wines, particularly these different varieties. And he said, I'm reading the label on this 06 Grenache, and you guys said, you should have drunk this by now, and you haven't given it to us. You're just releasing it. And part of what we do with ATP is we really do taste and say, is this ready? Is this beautiful drinking now? Yes. And if it's a long way away, which often happens with Syrah, or in this case, Grenache, we have to hold back and let those tannins resolve. So here we are, Eric, with the 06. And what about the vintage in 06?
Well, the vintage itself was quite a warm growing season. The summer was very hot. Grenache is a variety just like Zin that loves the sun, it loves the warmth. And here we have it growing alongside the Zin vines at Lytton Springs at Dry Creek Valley. So it's a really nice warm environment for it to grow. So it was able to ripen very quickly during that growing season. The harvest was in the month of September that year. It was a tannic vintage. I mean, we saw tannins extracting rapidly in all the varieties, the Cab at Montebello, the Zins likewise. So we had to really work the fermenters carefully. What we like to do with Grenache is open the rollers on our destemmer and destem the fruit, leave the berries uncrushed so that they're whole berries, and then pump that down to the fermenters so that we can keep the seeds surrounded by the pulp and by the skins so that they're not as extractable. But even then, we still got a fair amount of structure in this wine. and it just required a lengthy barrel aging of about 22, 24 months. We then bottled it. Once it was in bottle, we kept tasting it, trying to decide when to release it, and we just held on to it because it just was still austere, and we just released it in January. So after all this time, it's finally now resolved enough tannins. The fruit is really quite focused now. I mean, it's got just an impressive fruit, and that was really due to the growing season being so warm. The Grenache character was able to be real strong and dominant. But then it just took all this time for the tannins to finally settle down.
And you'll see on the label that if you have the wines in front of you, but I'll go over it, 80% Grenache, 10% Petit Syrah, which in fact is Southern Rhone. It's Syrah crossed with Pelersin from the 19th Durif.
Yeah.
And then 10% Zinfandel, which of course didn't exist in the Southern Rhone.
Yeah.
But in our Little Springs,
it's in some of the 100-year-old vines growing at the eastern part of the property, interplanted.
So we harvest that hill, the Grenache hill, and it's got this little bit of Zinfandel and Petit Syrah in it. So that's an unusual combination, but it's dominant.
But the Petit Syrah helps with the color. The Zin brings in the fruit. So in the total combination, it's just this amazing wine. But this is the last official vintage of the varietal bottling of Grenache.
Of Grenache, that's right.
Pure Grenache.
Pure.
We do a Syrah Grenache, which is...
so we're going to continue with the 50-50 blend.
And this has got to be one of the oldest plantings of Grenache anywhere in California.
Yeah, I've never heard of anything this old or older. This is 1902. 1902, yeah.
And I've heard you talk about sort of the mystery of this, Paul, in terms of this Grenache planting that we've attempted over the years to include it in the Lytton Springs Zinfandel, and it's just not an additive. It doesn't add anything to it.
No,
so it is a bit of a mystery, isn't it?
And you don't find it in the field blend parcels of the Zin blocks.
Like old patch at Geisel doesn't have any. And what people were bringing in, things like Grenache, Syrah, Counoise, all the Southern Rhone grapes, as well as Mourvedre, which is originally Spanish, and Carignan. And they weren't planning to make, for example, a Syrah. What they were trying to see is which of these grapes complement Zinfandel.
Right.
And we found, at least, that if the Grenache does not complement Zinfandel.
No, every time we've done our own little testing blends, it
just
makes the wine really tough and
we hold it up.
The body,
That's why we make this little bit.
Yeah, I know. So do you think that's what they were doing it? I mean, we don't really know.
Maybe they're experimenting. That they hadn't yet figured it out.
This one hill at Lytton East, that's Grenache. Half of the hill. The other half is the Zin planting.
They might have been making rosé. We don't know.
They could have been doing rosé, maybe even a port or something.
Sure.
Yeah.
Now, it's also true of Syrah. It doesn't. It's not a good complement for Zinfandel. And yet, Petit Syrah, which is half Syrah, half this unknown grape called Pelersin, is what? The ideal complement to Zinfandel. So, until you've done it, until you've grown it and made it, you don't know.
It's interesting. Okay. Well, we should push along to our second wine now, Paul and Eric, our 2007 Syrah Lytton Estate.
So we've been making Syrah since '96. When we bought the western section of Lytton Springs, the old Norton Ranch. So we inherited in that purchase 2 small blocks of Syrah and a small amount of Viognier that was also planted alongside the Syrah vines. So in '96, we brought the fruit in, fermented it no different than the Zins. We knew that, like in the Northern Rhone Valley, that if you've got Viognier, you put that into the fermenter with the Syrah and co-ferment, and that's what we did, and just produced an outstanding Syrah. And it just from there got better with every passing vintage. We started planting more parcels, and suddenly became flush and having a lot of Syrah.
But what we found was the original vines there were what came into California in just after during the First World War, actually, or the beginning of the 19th century.
Yeah, it's the Syrah
and it was
Noir.
called Syrah Noir. And a lot of the French, a lot of the people selling the new clones said, "Oh, that stuff is no good." So we experimented with what Antave, the French nurseries, were offering, and we had to rip it out because even when it was mature, it did not produce the quality that the old Syrah Noir did. And so here we are.
So yeah, we started planting with all these Antave clones, making the wine, and saying, it was definitely not comparable to the Syrah Noir that we already had there. So those vines were coming out, and we've kept in the ground the two original blocks, plus one other that actually worked out okay.
Yeah.
And every year the fruit comes in, we ferment the parcels separately, make a selection, and in 2007 came up with about 1,000 cases worth of this wonderful wine.
But quantities are limited because we didn't go ahead with those lesser clones.
Yeah.
We took them out, so
by
we
07,
don't have a lot. It's ATP.
It's 1,000 case production. That's all. Yeah. So the 12% Viognier, Eric, I mean, that's really, from the beginning, we have always co-fermented this wine, isn't that right?
We have.
Yeah.
Except in there was 98, 99, 2000, 2001. The original Viognier that we brought in was on AXR rootstock, so it was doomed. It was falling to phylloxera. It had to be ripped out, replanted. So there was that 4-year period that we didn't have the Viognier. So we were experimenting with Carignan. There was some Grenache in a couple of those vintages in small percentage, just to see if there was some way to help moderate the tannins of Syrah.
Sure.
I mean, that's ultimately why you want the Viognier there, is it helps soften the overall
and
palate.
And also bring up the nose.
It brings the fruit up. It really it enriches the wine. In a real positive way.
Makes the fermentation more complex, I imagine, when you have the two grapes together, and like color extraction as well.
Color extraction, you're able to stabilize a lot more color that way.
A lot of benefits from that. Absolutely.
So during those 4 years, we were missing Viognier so bad, and finally it started to come back, and
and 07, it needed some time.
It did.
So I mean, here we are releasing the 10s. And we're 3 years, 3 years more bottle age on this Syrah.
And 7, I mean, it extracted nicely. The tannins were in good balance, but Syrah is a more structured wine, so it still required all of this bottle age.
All right.
And what about the drinking window for this particular wine here, the 07?
I'd say like right now and over the next...
Let's hear this.
At
least. I mean, the structure is there.
You still can pull some of bottles of like the 97.
Sure.
They're still showing very well.
And that's 10 years older than this. So
that's always the complexity of asking that question, isn't it? It's really how you like your wine, isn't it?
But we have held these back to let them really come into a stage where they are enjoyable wines. So you definitely can try them, and then if you want to go further,
really good fruit
in terms
right now.
In terms of complexity, you can give it more years.
Okay.
So,
and in terms of food pairings, just to mention, there are some recipes on our website, and there is a recipe particularly designed to go with this wine, which is a spiced beef stew, which was actually a recipe developed by Kathy Martinich, who just recently retired, but worked here at Ridge for over 40 years.
But she's still cooking.
She still cooks for us, and she's still an important part of our team here in that sense. So this is one of Kathy's recipes and designed to go with the Syrah, so I'd recommend you giving that a go.
Right.
All right. So shall we push ahead to some Zinfandel now?
So the old school.
Yeah.
Okay.
maybe
this was released in February this year. Nice, cool month. Well, actually, February was kind of nice, warm weather. So
in a lot of places,
the time. This cooler weather is perfect for this wine.
Well, but back east it may not be as cool. Yeah. So, and the thing about the old school is that it's in Geiseville Township, and it's some of the Geiseville blocks that are really close to this old, basically 100-year-old school called Independent School, and that was the name we actually originally used, was Independent School for this. But what it allowed us to do was that whenever some of the blocks in this area of the Geiseville vineyard are riper than the Geiseville, and that if we include it in the Geiseville, it pushes the Geiseville sort of out of its classic style and into something that's riper than we want to see for that wine or have seen over the years, then we can pull these couple of parcels out and make the old school. And so the old school is always a riper, bigger wine than the Geiseville,
Right.
but it allows the Geiseville to stay within its confines of the classic example. So we were kidding that if the cool weather is gone, you should probably wait until next winter because
This is a winter wine?
It's really much a
winter wine.
alcohol. It's got residual sugar. It's really powerful and it's fruit character. And
it's one of our few wines that occasionally goes over 15, and our Zinfandels.
And it's not made every year. I mean, we're of course sampling the vineyards carefully, trying to avoid letting any parcel go overripe. But it all comes down to the vintage. How fast can you pick? Are you in the middle of a heat wave? If you suddenly have many parcels at Lytton and Geiseville to pick all at once, there's going to be a few that are going to be left behind that might end up producing a style.
And there was a lot of fans for this wine.
Exactly,
People do love this style, and although it's not produced every vintage, it's a style that appeals to a lot of people.
Yeah,
It does.
Yeah.
it's really kind of a typical style for a lot of people in Zinfandel
this
these
is
days.
most
producers
are going. This is their standard.
It's not our style,
ours, no.
and yet when it happens, we'll put it out.
Yeah.
It's typically not a national release.
Yeah,
it's a
this
small,
is a very
quantity.
small amount. Yeah.
So, but for people that like that,
Here
old
it is.
school is there. So it's
And what about ageability on a wine like this? I mean, I imagine the small amount of residual sugar could help it with
Residual
ageability.
is good, and it's also the fact that it's Geiseville. It's going to have acidity, and then on top of that, the sweetness. That's going to carry it for a very long time.
Yeah.
It's like probably the 77 Geiseville that
77.
had some residual.
It's only
and
just now,
opulence, and
not
it's still
quite-
very drinkable.
It's very drinkable. It's not as good as it was 5 years ago, but my God, that's a long time. Now, in general, overripe wines don't age very well.
Right.
But when you've got this level of acidity and this structure, you have the chance to see a wine in this style that will age.
This is a real win-win, isn't it, with this wine? You can enjoy it now or enjoy it later.
Although it's so sensuous right now that I think most people are going to drink it in the next couple of years.
Yeah,
So,
but 99% of it will be consumed
yeah,
in the next couple of years. But
pretty quickly.
And we actually
delicious.
we have a recipe for this wine as well online for the Old School Zin. It's a tagine de mouton, a lamb stew that was actually. This is one of your wife's recipes.
Yes,
it is. So one of Maureen's recipes, and this is available online as well. So suggest you give that a go. I know many people have and really have enjoyed that, so that should be quite good. So good. So we've worked our way through the 3 ATP wines, and now we're going to move into the Z-List program, our Zinfandel program, and taste the 3 Zinfandels that we released this spring. We'll be tasting the 2010s here, the Paso Robles, the East Bench, and the Geyserville. And the first wine in the lineup is the Paso Robles. And we should obviously talk about the 2010 vintage a little bit here, Eric and Paul, and the impact of that, and maybe how it was different between Paso and up in Sonoma County.
Yeah, I think it's good. I mean, even though Paso was an exception, I think by showing what really happened on the North Coast.
Yeah, the North Coast got devastated.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a really late winter, went long, lots of rainfall, and then a cool summer with lots of fog. So there was all sorts of issues in the vineyard. The vines were behind schedule, veraison was late, and there was just not enough heat to really suppress mildew. So many of the farmers up there, including ourselves, started to open up the canopy, pulling leaves. And then on the 23rd of August came this incredible heat wave. At Geiseville, with our weather station there, we were monitoring weather, seeing the nighttime low that morning was down in the 40s. And then by 4 o'clock that afternoon, on the 23rd, it was 113 degrees. So that was the most intense heat those vines had seen in many years, and for that whole entire season. So they were not acclimated to deal with it. So any of the sun-exposed clusters on those vines on the western side of the vine were completely destroyed by intense heat. With their connective tissue, the stem to the vine, it was pretty much burned, and that fruit just couldn't ripen.
And this fruit at this point was just really entering veraison too, is that right?
Exactly. I mean, veraison was kind of maybe 40% complete.
Yeah.
And then came that heat, and then the stem tissue was just fried, so those clusters just suddenly died. And they were just trapped at that 19 bricks level and suddenly turned into raisins and shriveled.
Most of it fell off, is that right?
Well, we had to go through and actually drop all that fruit.
Yeah, so
it was
we had to
total
do-
loss. 49% loss.
Yeah.
Just because of difficult weather in the spring, we've seen 10%, 15%,
Right.
sometimes a little more, never 50%. I mean, so on the North Coast, Geyserville, Lytton Springs, all of the wines up there, for us, are down by 50%. But the exception, which we'll talk about, is Paso Robles.
Right.
But what happened, as Eric just said, at Geyserville and Lytton Springs, and of course East Bench, we went in and dropped any fruit that was damaged.
Right.
And as if we were harvesting, we just went in and dropped it on the ground. So what happened is what then came in was in beautiful condition. And as we get to those two wines, we'll talk about just
And then
how
the
exceptional
weather
they are.
after that heat wave was just perfect. So the undamaged fruit then had this 2-3 week window to just get this incredible flavor and color development. So it really made these amazing wines.
And
in
with half the
2010
crop
vintage.
load, too, right?
Yeah,
Exactly. So the
all
vine,
the intensity.
suddenly it was like going in and doing a serious thinning
Right.
of fruit. And then the rest of it just got this amazing intensity.
Yeah.
And
But
down
in Paso,
there we go.
oh my God.
Talk a bit about that.
So, I mean, a good crop. I mean, it wasn't a huge crop, but for the growing season being a cooler season across California in that really hot, warm region, it was ideal. It actually allowed, there's a lot more oscillation between warm day, cool night as the fog and the cool breezes were coming off the Pacific.
Right.
The temperatures were able to drop back. It allowed the grapes to ripen a little bit more slowly and develop more color, more tannin, and hold on to their acidity.
Yeah, the amazing thing there was
good
that
acid this year.
Paso Robles typically is not that firm in acid. It's beautiful, really drinking and ages. But this year, the acidities were so firm all across the board, but particularly in Paso. So a lot of people have said, but this tastes like a North Coast Zinfandel. And the reason is that for a Paso, that acid is so firm. It's just a beautiful example of Paso.
Yeah, it's got a lot better fruit dimension because, again, that cooler growing season allowed for longer hang time and for the fruit to ripen in a way that it avoided that typical kind of Paso Robles, prunish, raisin character. So this fruit is just amazing this year.
Just to step back, we did get a question because oftentimes we utilize terminology and people are curious about what do we mean when we say drop fruit and what impact does that have during a harvest to do that?
Well, in this case, we were dropping it
Dropping
because
the
of
damaged fruit, yeah.
But what we go through any year is when we've set a big crop, we say, wait a minute,
There's too many clusters.
too many
on these
clusters.
vines,
Are we going to get the intensity?
Yeah.
And in the case of Montebello, we say, wait a minute, in a cool region like Montebello, are we going to get full ripeness with this bigger crop? And so the French call it green harvest.
Green harvest, yeah.
We go through and cut off the clusters. And one great thing to do is at Veraison, you can see some grapes of some clusters
Could kind of
immediately
even out the
that's right.
the vine.
They turn
the
color
fruit.
sooner, and they leave behind some pink or green clusters, and those are the ones you drop.
Okay.
And we usually don't thin very hard until Veraison. We don't thin it set, even though it's a big crop, maybe a little bit, but we really wait till Veraison.
Yeah, I mean,
color
the more
change.
you can leave the fruit on the vine, it kind of keeps the vine under a lot more stress. The berry size stays smaller. And then the real important time to get in and thin is at the veraison, to remove the pink clusters.
So by doing this, it's going to ensure ripeness and
good
concentration.
intensity.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Veraison, I'm sure most people know, but still to say it, is the point in which, in California, the old guys say coloring up.
Yes.
It's when it goes from green to
deep
red
purple,
and deeper and then purple, but red first.
That's veraison.
That's Veraison.
Okay. Good.
Which in Zin it can usually be all over the place. It's an uneven variety. So on a vine, you can have a full range of some clusters fully colored up,
Yeah.
Others that are green, and even on a cluster, you can have the sun-facing side fully colored, the back half, the shaded side green. So it makes for very uneven ripening.
For Zinfandel,
Yeah.
pretty challenging to decide,
Right.
make a picking
Yeah,
decision.
making the picking decision there
Yeah.
is tough.
And if you've had 2 points in which clusters have ripened, you have what's called a second crop.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have a nice long fall, you don't pick those clusters
Yeah.
that are lighter colored, and you haven't dropped them because the crop is not large. You let those ripen, and
Yeah,
usually
3-4 weeks later, it
they come in and they
Good
can
stuff.
be equal to the first crop. If you have a nice warm fall to let them ripen.
And this is also brings up the point of the advantage of estate vineyards with the Geyserville and the Lytton and the East Bench, where we're doing all the farming ourselves, particularly in a challenging vintage like 2010. There's huge advantages to having estate vineyards, isn't there?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
There's when you're in charge of every phase of it, because if someone's growing the grapes for you, and you're even though you work with them very closely, you're paying by the ton, and it's harder for them to drop as much crop
Yeah.
as you would drop.
Yeah.
And because our focus, of course, is the highest quality, not quantity.
Yeah.
Right.
Quality is the name of the game.
Good.
So.
So this Paso,
Yeah.
what can we say about it, Eric?
Wow.
In terms
Well, it's
of the wine?
100% varietal. The vines were planted in 1923, and it's all dry farmed, gravelly soil in that nice warm region. But again, in 2010, it was cooler, more moderate temperatures. The fruit was picked, let's say, mid-September. It's about a 40-acre piece of land, but broken into roughly 5 different areas, 5 different parcels that can range over for picking about 3 to 4 weeks to get all the fruit brought in. I like to often put the Paso Robles fruit into our submerged cap capable tanks where we can keep the skins under the juice for the full duration of the natural yeast fermentation. That helps extract color because there's no Petit Syrah there to provide more color, more tannin. So by doing the submerged cap, we can get a little bit more structure into the wine. It enhances the richness and the structure. Let's see, malolactics in 2010, because it was a little bit more acidic, did take their time. So we had to be really patient with this wine. But, ultimately it did finish. And it went to American oak barrels for aging. And
As with everything
As
else.
everything, I mean, yeah. So
And
no
Paso
difference there.
often is slow in starting and getting going in malolactic.
It can take its time.
And these are natural malolactics.
Yeah.
So we're not inoculating. So we just allow the natural process. And in the case of Paso, it can take time.
Yeah.
We've got lots of questions coming in. I can't deal with all of them, but specifically about what you were speaking about, Eric, in terms of what effect does having a submerged cap have on tannin extraction and pump overs? What is the impact of pump overs?
We're still doing pump overs. Pump overs is just the homogenizing of the juice through the cap, mixing the nutrients off the bottom to keep the natural yeast
And aerate.
fed and aerating it, because fermentation is a reductive process. The yeast need oxygen, and so by pumping the juice first into a tub, splashing it, providing oxygen, and then pumping that over the top of the tank helps with the whole extraction process. Submerged cap, just allows continued extraction while we're not actively pumping over. So it's a slow extraction, a gentle process. Really provides fine quality tannins.
And it's literally just a grid.
It's just a grid perforated.
Yeah.
It's keeps the skins about 12 inches under the juice.
Okay.
And there's a lot of heat. There's a lot of bubbling activity
Okay.
as the yeast are fermenting. There's pressure, and so it's able to release through the perforations of the grid.
And you're getting color and tannin.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, if you use the usual approach of pumping over or punching down, the only time that all those skins are fully in contact with the juice is when you're doing that.
Right.
Sometime during the day. I mean, a few people stay up all night, but in Burgundy or Pinot Noirs or something, punching down. But in this case, though it's very gentle, it's being held, in the juice 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
And so with Paso, which doesn't extract as quickly as the North Coast Zins,
Okay.
it really brings out that color and tannin.
Okay. Good. Well, thanks for that. Yeah. So we should maybe move forward to the second Zinfandel, which is our 2010 East Bench.
And normally we would have John Olney
Yes.
here, who's the winemaker who made it, and because it's the one wine that he of this group, because in the fall he's even
Yes,
more
the
involved.
Lytton and more wines. Yes.
But it's a great comparison with the Paso. Totally different region, and also different level of ripeness, because Paso is more moderate. This is a big, rich Zinfandel from the bench above Lytton Springs, but it's also 100%.
Yeah.
So it's a great combination to see Paso at 100% Zin from that region, and East Bench 100% Zin from the North Coast.
And quite different age of vines.
That's a big deal, isn't it?
Yeah. So we have our old vines in Paso, and then here's a property that we took in the
2000
early
or so.
2000 and redeveloped it. Was
So
a
10,
vineyard
12-year-old
pre-prohibition.
vines.
That's right. Planted around 2000.
And the
So
others are 1923.
Yeah,
or something.
1923.
Yeah.
big difference, and that has a big impact on the alcohol levels of these two wines, doesn't
True.
it? In terms of the
The
Paso.
plant physiology,
Yeah.
old vine versus young vine. I mean, just the fruit and how it develops sugar flavor. Old vines are slower growing, not as productive. The yields are smaller. Flavor tends to lead sugar, but in young vines, it's complete opposite. They're vigorous and growing big canopies, lots of photosynthetic surface.
Right.
And they're putting a lot of sugar into the fruit, and yet the flavors are always right behind sugar.
Right.
So you tend to have to go a little bit higher alcohol
To get the full
potentials to
ripeness.
get this intensity.
Yeah.
But because it's Dry Creek Valley, it's in a terroir that tends to be more tannic.
Yeah.
So
the
there's
structure
really
is
no
there.
need for Petite Syrah to be in this vineyard because it's got plenty of tannin of its own coming from the Zin. And in this particular vintage, we've got plenty of acidity.
Yeah,
That's the
absolutely.
great thing about the 2010 vintage is we've got high acid across the board in all the varieties.
Geiseville always has.
Yeah,
high acid,
Geiseville is always
but
acidic.
Lytton
but
and
East Bench
and
it's
Paso
yeah.
are typical
unusual to
Zinfandels
have
that are
that
moderate.
acidity.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
So to see that acidity here is great.
So this 2010 vintage is pretty unusual to see this level of acidity across the board. And we were talking earlier about how maybe the stamp of the vintage here is so strong, it actually is making these wines more similar than they normally are.
Yeah, in a sense.
It is,
Yeah.
Yeah. And the quality is there, albeit for us, the difficulty of half a crop.
Yes.
So it's, we're not doing a lot
Right,
of
it's-
new
yeah.
improvements in buildings and whatever this year because we only have half as much
Agricultural
wine to
risk.
sell.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's Mother Nature.
Well, yeah, and we're farming roughly 75-80% of what we're producing.
That's right.
So we take on all that agricultural risk, and most years we don't encounter the issues of the 2010 vintage.
Yeah.
But when it does happen, you definitely feel the effects.
Yes, you feel Mother Nature.
And,
Yes.
and if you're buying your grapes, then it's the grower who takes
Yeah.
the hit.
Right.
Because you simply pay for what he gives you. And if he's down 50%, he's the one that takes
right.
the hit.
Yeah.
But for us, it's absolutely worthwhile because you can control the quality when you're the farmer. And there's nothing like that.
And with
for it.
Zinfandel, you have to be
to
your
do it.
own farmer. I
Yeah.
mean, we've been farming it for such a long time. We have really mastered the farming of Zin because it is a really unique variety.
Yeah, you don't want to.
Very special variety.
You don't want to subcontract that out, do you?
No.
No. I mean, this is it.
Unless you don't care for your quality going
Going
all
up and
over the
down.
place.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's not what we want to do. We want consistency.
And if you don't have consistency, you can't see the character of the particular site.
Yeah.
With wines that, for example, that each vintage just vary immensely, you're not seeing the site. You're seeing whatever else going
Yeah.
on, but
Okay.
not the site. And what we really try to do with all these wines is that we've found some great sites and that they have distinctive individual character. that you can see over the years, and that's what's important to us.
And that's one of our key tenets, Paul, isn't it? And it's also a unique opportunity to have, we have 3 Zinfandels, 3 different vineyards, same vintage, but different personalities. And this is really at the core of what we do, isn't it?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's move ahead to the 2010 Geyserville, the last of our Zinfandels here. Production way down on the
Yes.
Geyserville, as all Sonoma Zins, but why don't you tell us about this wine a little bit, Eric? I mean,
The Geyserville has been made by Ridge since 1966.
Yeah.
And, so we've had a really long history working this piece of ground that's really quite special in terms of its composition, the age of the vines. It's this ancient riverbed, so it's all this rocky soil, well-drained soil, gravel, and vines that were planted in the 1880s, 1890s, into the current century. And so, we've got all these amazing little parcels to harvest within this vineyard, and then select down from there. Once we have the finished wines in the cellar, we taste and make a selection of what we think are the most distinct, that carry great aging potential, blend well together to make a fabulous Geyserville. And that's what we have in 2010. It's a smaller production, but a wonderfully concentrated wine.
Absolutely.
Made to age. Zin is supposed to be a variety that's got a lot of good fruit definition, sensuous qualities. And so we have that here, but then we have, beyond that, the aging potential. We've got many decades worth of Geyservilles in our library to taste back through time and really see how fabulous the aging potential is for the site.
We don't encourage people to wait 30 years, but if you have a bottle of, say, the 70 or 73 Geyserville, or 74 for that matter, that was well stored, it is incredible wine today. And so, but that's not what Zinfandel is about. It's just that with a really great vineyard, you can have that ageability and that degree of just complexity.
So do you have a favorite time period to drink your Geyserville in terms of a favorite window?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, you have this
10, 15-year period.
Right.
10 to 15?
See, for example, I was a marvelous man from England who's been buying our wines for 30 years was here, and he's in the classical music business, and we tasted the 11 Geyserville where we've just done a first assemblage. It's not at all complete, and he was just saying, "My God, this is so beautiful right now." And I said, that's the thing about Zinfandel. There's that immediacy, and yet, if with any of our Zinfandels, if you can wait just a year or 2 or 3, the level of complexity comes up. It's not just the fruit. It begins, and of course, as Eric's saying, if you have the discipline to go a little beyond that, 7, 8, 9, whatever.
When they're that old.
But it's not what we say you have to do. Montebello, we say, listen, you really should give it 10 years.
Yeah.
But even though it's balanced and delicious, but with these wines, we say you can start early, but if you put a couple of bottles away and just see what happens, then, this is something else.
Okay. So in terms of food pairings, I sort of glossed over, we do have a recipe for the East Bench, short ribs recipe. It's around dinner time here. I'm starting to get hungry. And for the Geyserville, also on the website, there's a really nice recipe for pulled pork, which I think sounds like a really neat combination with the Geyserville. So.
Is that yours, or is that?
I wonder why.
No, that was actually, we have a chef from a restaurant developed that for us.
Okay.
So,
I made one, but that was for an ATP wine. Yet to be released.
All right, so let's push on now to the third tier of wines. We have the third 3 wines, which is 3 different vintages of the Montebello. The 2009, which was just recently shipped to our collector members. And then the 2010, which is still in barrel, and the 11, which is still in barrel.
We just assembled in barrel. It's the baby here.
And people will have an opportunity to come and try the 11 Montebello at the upcoming barrel tasting as well. Right. So if people want to come, they do have the opportunity to taste this wine themselves.
Eric showed it. You showed it in Washington,
D.C. last month.
Because that's the only other chance, and it is admittedly the first assemblage. So we'll go back in May. And with a couple of lots that were just so beautiful, but hadn't come around far enough to improve it. And so it's going to be just slight change from where you see it now, or we see it now, because unfortunately we weren't able to send these two out to.
That'd be a little difficult.
Yes. So it's a great series for us of 9, 10, 11 that it's been 3 of the cooler vintages in California, and yet in our poor soils and with our viticulture and our different climate from much of California here in the Santa Cruz Mountains, we've got full ripeness and absolute incredible quality in all these vintages. And if you've seen the assemblage data on our website for the 11, it talks about the fact that once we come to this blend, we taste it against the 10, 9, 8, 7, and say blind, mix it in and say, okay, is it as young as it is? Yes, you can spot it, but does it have the basis for the complexity that these others have? And so with the 11, that's where we are. So let's start in with the 9, Eric.
Well, 9, I mean, it was a cool, long winter, and suddenly it turned summer and was rather hot in the month of June, July, and that helped kind of get the vines back on schedule. So we were able to harvest in the month of sort of end of September, which begins really with Merlot. It's the first variety to bud out here and set its crop, so it's always the first to ripen on Montebello, and then it's followed by Cabernet Sauvignon, and then Petit Verdot, and then Franc, and then it kind of progresses from the bottom of the vineyard on up to the top. So it's usually a 5-week span of time to harvest all of Montebello. But in 2009, with that hot summer, the vines were able to catch up in a way that we were able to actually pull off getting all the fruit before the 13th of October that year. So it was early.
What was important about that day?
Well, we saw on the satellite and all the weather forecasts a big storm brewing over the Pacific. It was first a typhoon over Japan. It had caught another low pressure in the Gulf of Alaska and strengthened and came across the Pacific and slammed right into California.
And we knew this
with some force.
10 days in advance. So anybody who, my feeling, anybody who had real experience in grape growing, wine growing, said, wait a minute, I really need to pick before this hits, because this is going to be 6 inches, 8 inches, disaster. And it's going to take my ripeness back down, and depending on the weather, it may never fully recover.
Right.
And so here, with our low yields, we had been picking along, and we were going to kind of be a little relaxed and take 10 days to pick.
Right.
Well, we looked at that and said, the grapes are ripe. Bring in our guys from up at Geyserville and Lytton Springs. Bring them down to help us part of the time. And because we use our full-time workers to do all of our picking.
Right.
And
they're
the
with us.
And the
families. Everybody's out
picking,
there. And so we picked all of the grapes fully ripe before that storm hit. And so for us, the 09 is just, got the
just
depth,
turned out amazing.
character. It's wonderful.
Yeah, so every vineyard parcel was selected or fermented separately, put to barrel for the natural malolactics, and then we came around in, I want to say, late January that next year, tasted through the lots, made our selection, and put together just a beautiful vintage of Montebello.
Yeah.
And partly because Bordeaux had done such a number on the 09 and some very good wines, and riper because of global warming and so on, and because of their decision to pick late, that they could wait, so they did. But also the pricing and so on, which was unfortunate. Let's put it that way. It doesn't give people the chance, or as many people the chance to taste some of those famous wines as in my case I got to do when they were really reasonable. But so I added to what Eric had written, probably some of the most arrogant words we've ever done, which was, in 10, 20, or 30 years, this Montebello 09 is going to stand up to any region in the world. And very arrogantly, we feel in those years, out there at 20 or 30 years, it's going to be unusual if any of the great Bordeaux's can surpass this. So it's pretty arrogant.
Well, and literally at a fraction of the price, too.
Oh, yes, of course. I mean, that's not the business we're in.
No.
So.
Yeah, well, here we are in a cooler vintage with a decision to pick before the rain, and still we get 13.5 alcohol, which is above our 20-year average.
The grapes were ready.
They were.
There was no reason to wait and take
Yeah.
that kind of risk, like many of the folks in the North Coast who did. Suddenly, then they were facing, the grapes receiving 6 inches of rain, and then all the rot that ensued after the rain. It just became a real disaster.
Well, these cooler vintages, Paul, are really sort of putting a lot of producers in a bit of a pickle here in terms of, they're trying to reach these ripeness levels that are virtually unattainable in the current climate, really, aren't they? Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting, and we don't know for sure, but a lot of the climate models show that the coast of California, which just not only includes us here at Montebello, very close to the coast at 15 miles, but even Napa, who is considerably inland. I don't know what would be the typical about 40 60 miles. But still, they're affected. Some of the climate models show that we are, in fact, going to be cooler.
Yeah.
And certainly these last 3 years, represented right here, Europe has been warmer, we have been cooler.
Yes.
And so it may be that what I'd love to see, and that is that we moderate these overripe wines and we get back to something that is somewhere between underripe and the overripe that's been the standard. And these 3 vintages are kind of forcing that. If this continues, a style more in this character is going to be what you can do consistently rather than see ups and downs in your style.
It's interesting, though, that even with the cool vintages that we've seen here at Montebello, that given the inversion layer and our location here, we're still able to get ripeness even in these cooler vintages.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah.
Because we're not carrying large crops.
Yeah.
And we're on top of making sure the vines are balanced for the season. So if it's a late start season, we always adjust down the yields even lower.
Right.
We drop more crop than I'd say because we know that if it's a cool year, it's going to be difficult to ripen a big
And we
crop.
did roll out some reflective material this last year, and that helped.
We just got a
enhance
question, what is an inversion layer?
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Well, in our elevation, as the valley below us warms up, all that warm air will rise during the night into our region, our elevation point, and it becomes this cushion of warm air, and it keeps the nights warm, and then the days warmer.
Yeah. We're literally above the fog.
Yeah,
And the fog is down
as the
there.
fog comes into the valley, it kind of forces that warm air up to our elevation point.
So, people that have flown into San Francisco and seen, everything covered in fog and just the mountains above, we're above the fog.
Above the
And
fog.
so we get that warmth, the sun comes up and we have
and you
it
can see that
down
driving
there.
up Montebello Road in the morning,
Sure.
50 degrees at the base of the mountain and 70 degrees at the winery.
That's an
So
inversion.
that's the
That's an
inversion.
inversion.
Yeah.
Right.
Good. So 2010, Eric.
Okay.
Let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, 9, we were still technically in drought. We had below average rainfall. Even though the winter was long, most of the rain actually that year came in the month of March, April. So it was late enough rain that the vines were able to kind of get through that hot summer and still had plenty of groundwater resources. 10, we were completely out of drought. It was this intense, wet winter here. Lots of just torrential storms. I think it rained every single day in the month of March. It rained during bloom, so yields were knocked down. And then summer was quite cool here. We didn't have much of an inversion layer here. But what saved us, or what allowed us to get, ultimately 13.2 alcohol in this wine, was some inversion, but that inversion came towards the end of the season.
Yeah. We were talking about the coolness of the 2010 vintage in Sonoma.
Yeah.
And obviously that had an impact on us.
And
as well.
luckily, we were above those fogs that were
yeah.
really
Yeah.
affecting the North Coast. So having elevation saved us in 2010. It kept the vines dry, but still the overall temperature was on the low side.
Right.
But then it was that late season warmth that really turned things around. It allowed the flavors of the grapes to suddenly develop to the point where they were ready to harvest.
And we were lucky that, what we grow on the North Coast is Zinfandel.
Right.
Yeah.
And that ripens sooner than Cabernet,
Yeah.
Right.
considerably. And so the cool season did not affect, yes, it had that disastrous effect in quantity, but it didn't affect
It didn't have
ripeness.
any
We could
effect.
get, with those warm days, we could get full ripeness.
Right.
Here at Montebello, we were up above those fogs, no problems. Great.
Yeah,
vintage.
and we weren't. We always pull leaves to some extent to make sure that the fruit has sunlight. But in the 2 days of intense heat that hit the North Coast, it was hot here, but not hot enough to cause any damage.
Sure.
Okay.
And our general strategy as far as winemaking is in Montebello, the case of this fruit, it contains a lot of tannin, so we are always very careful with the extraction. So just like the Grenache, the Syrah, it's all whole berry, destemmed. And in 2009, we actually remodeled the crush pad, put in conveyance system, and berry sorting equipment, so we were able to kind of pull out stem fragments or green berries from the fruit before committing it to the fermenter.
Right.
So we were fully utilizing that in 2010. And that was actually very beneficial because there was an uneven set that year. During bloom, there was some green berries that formed that were on the same cluster with the fully ripe berries. And so we really, we picked the fruit, but then resorted to sorting the green berries out manually.
Yeah. When you say, quote unquote, a challenging vintage, right?
It meant a very labor-intensive vintage.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, of
And
getting the fruit
we haven't
picked and
mentioned
brought in.
this, but in 9 and 10 and 11, the worry with the weather, with the cold
yeah.
summers, you begin to say, wait a minute, is this ever going to get ripe?
Sure.
So, when we say difficult, it may have turned out beautifully with a lot of extra work, but also what was difficult was your level of stress.
It's the anxiety.
The anxiety.
It was a high anxiety
Yeah,
vintage.
that's right. So even though it turned out so beautifully with a lot of hard work, there was that anxiety, and that adds to when people say it was a difficult vintage.
Well, our consumers don't feel any of that, right? They just get to enjoy
Hopefully
it.
just keep sitting there.
Well, it's our job to do all the work so we can get it to the bottle.
Right.
But it did turn out wonderful. This
Yeah.
wine has just got some incredible aroma.
Yeah.
It's been sitting in barrel now for about 16 months.
We'll go probably,
American
18?
oak, new oak. Nice diverse mix of, barrels from wood sourced from Appalachia, West Virginia to Ozark, Minnesota. And we will bottle it at the end of May.
At the end of May.
Yeah.
There we go.
In the May. All right.
Which is pretty typical. That's
Yeah.
more or less. But it depends. We've gone as late as August.
Yeah, we have.
And we've been, I
Like
think, as
2003
early
we
as
went.
April or something.
With 99.
99.
Yeah.
So, but typical is end of May.
End of May is normal.
But we're
Okay.
tasting to say, has it come together? At what point is it ready to
go into the
go
bottle. Okay.
Yeah.
And none of it required any egg white fining.
Nothing, yeah.
Again, it all
Right.
comes down to very careful fermentation,
Yeah.
doing carefully decided pump overs by taste. Initially, you do it because you want to get the natural yeast fermented, get oxygen to the juice. But then once the fermentation's active and the cap's rising, there's lots of heat being generated by the yeast, they begin to extract a lot of color and tannin. That's when you have to really sit there and begin to really taste carefully and see how much tannin's entering the juice, the free run.
I would
to
imagine
then back off.
watching the press and press fractions is a big
Oh,
part.
yeah,
that's
and
another
that's
thing.
very little press wines ever brought back into Montebello. Just
yeah.
the finest fractions will come in immediately into the free run, and then they go to barrel.
Yeah.
But
Well,
we're
this is
extremely
a-
careful.
We should say, what is a press fraction?
Well, first of all, most of the world, it's first press, second press.
Yeah.
And it's the pressure that's
Yeah,
put
the
on
amount of
whatever
force,
kind of
yeah,
press,
that
the
extracts.
force that's put on those wet skins
Right.
to extract it. And And what we developed back in 97, 96, 97
we
really
created 7 different fractions that year.
That year was 7 fractions. We've limited it down to
it's 5.
5 fractions.
Yeah.
But there is a real difference between those 5 fractions, and the best of them, and sometimes never the first squeeze.
Yeah,
the early
first
on.
squeeze is really just too liquid and herbal and aggressive, so it's the largest amount of pressed wine as well.
Right.
And we have to get rid of it.
So if anything gets bulked out, that gets bulked out.
That's not going into Montebello or any of our wines.
No, not at all.
No.
But you end up with a lot of different lots now, where you start with 30 or 40 lots of wine coming from the mountain, and then you do add the rest
fractions on top of that.
5 fractions.
Yeah.
And
Suddenly you have like 150 something barrels of all these different fractions.
To try and put
we've
together.
We've got to taste those, get them together, decide what goes, what doesn't go. Now, one thing to say about this whole thing that Eric mentioned about attention during the fermentation. A real difference between what we do at Montebello and Bordeaux.
Okay.
Because a lot of our techniques are really 19th century California, 19th century Bordeaux techniques. We're not, I refer to as pre-industrial winemaking, because this is traditional winemaking, where it transforms itself with a lot of guidance from us, experienced guidance. Okay, what we've gone on to do in Bordeaux, they extract, they do maceration, so on, and then they have to step in every year and find those tannins back.
Okay.
Because if you taste in Bordeaux the young wines, it's just, I am just shocked at the level of tannin. And with us, what we've decided is that in the fermenter, we'll do our damnedest to moderate, to keep those tannins within the parameter.
Tannin.
Yeah, so that they can go to bottle. Instead of having to be fine. And this is unusual, and Eric said that usually about 20% we early find, because they've just gone over the level. They're great wines, but if we add them to the blend, they bring too much tannin, and so we find them early. But that's at most 20%. This year, nothing.
No, we try to avoid it when possible.
Yeah,
and so far, nothing in the 11.
So this is really the difference between doing it based on a formula and doing it based upon taste.
That's right.
Okay.
We
recipe.
avoid the formula. Other than it's the natural approach to
it's like
to winemaking.
Yeah, any chef, he's doing it by taste.
Okay.
And unfortunately, my wife is a great cook, but I'm not. And so I do Marcella Hazan, an Italian recipe, and I have the book there, and I'm measuring exactly, and the kitchen is a mess.
Right.
And she's doing it by taste.
Right.
And there's no comparison. So what I say is, forget the recipes. Do it by experience, by taste.
Yeah,
because you're going to have high tannin years, low tannin years.
Sure.
You have to quickly adapt to that.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's something we're seeing by taste. And
Sure.
we can adjust our pump over schedules, even do a period of no pump overs, but still circulate the juice below the cap to keep the yeast fermenting.
Okay.
And we'll do that until we're closer to dryness. And without having the sugar there, we can actually then taste and really see the true structure of the wine, and do one last final pump over right at the very end, flesh out the wine, drain it, press it, and be satisfied.
This is something really that Eric has brought to winemaking at Montebello, and that is this idea of right at the end, having held back, we'll taste and say, okay, the tannins are under control, but the middle hasn't filled out. And so we'll pump over just for whatever it takes to do one turn in that fermenter.
Okay.
And we'll come back in 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and the middle has just filled out. We stop.
Yet the tannins are still
and the tannins are still balanced.
That's the moment you separate the
really
press.
Yeah.
So we have one last wine here, and we're really right up against the clock, but we want to talk a little bit about the 2011 Montebello, and obviously another cool vintage.
Another cool year, yeah.
And looking
and
at
what
this,
was more difficult or challenging, 10 or 11? They both were, but in the end, the 11, just the weather saved us once again here at Montebello. Elevation, we were above the fogs, and we did have a little bit more rainfall to contend to or deal with during the season, but we had this 3-week window in the month of October to then fully ripen this crop.
Yeah.
We got some early October rains.
Yeah.
But right after that, and this cool summer, so things were not ready
Right.
at that point. But those 3 weeks that Eric's saying,
3 weeks,
just beautiful. And we knew then, as that 3 week period ended, there were these early November rains coming.
Yeah.
And we said,
No, yeah.
just like 10, we said, no, and 9, no,
Yeah.
we're not. And I think we got 91% of the grapes.
91% of the grapes.
9% still out there. And we sort of said, okay, that 9% we can write off. And in fact, several of
Some
those
of those
guys,
actually
after
went
that
in.
second
Dried
rain,
out.
came in and,
Yeah, it
and
was
just
really
some beautiful
those
wines.
few storms at the end of October, early November. I mean, very minor amount of rainfall.
Unless you had been under the fogs.
Yeah,
And
that
the first
was-
time
yeah.
ever for Cabernet that I know in California, and you'll get people writing about this, the most in the North Coast for Cabernet, the most difficult vintage that anyone's seen, because they were under these wet fogs all summer,
Yeah.
as was our Zinfandel,
Mm-hmm.
but it ripens earlier. And so by trying to wait beyond that second rain, it was too much water even for Cabernet, which has a thick skin,
Yeah.
and there was a great deal of damage.
And there was a lot of humidity after that first October rain. Then suddenly things were really at that perfect optimal condition for mildew.
So
And it just took off in a lot of the North Coast vineyards.
botrytis and the whole thing.
So this is one of these vintages where there's a danger of all of California being painted with this brush about what happened in Napa Cab.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
here we've produced a beautiful vintage
Yeah.
because of our different climate and different philosophy. But I think people are going to be hearing a lot of negative things about the 2011 vintage coming up over the next couple of years.
Sure, absolutely. And a handful of people on the floor of Napa actually picked before that second rain. And even though the style was back to the style of the 96 or 95.
Early 90s,
Yeah, the earlier 90s. They made some beautiful wines, but it was literally a handful of people.
Yeah.
The people that waited through that second rain, the danger of being able to make the quality that they usually make was really great. So we'll hear a lot about this vintage.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And quantities will be very limited, I'm
Yeah.
sure, out of the North Coast
I hope
because
that
there was a
selection-
lot of lost fruit.
Yeah, and I
We
hope
had
that-
a pretty reasonably sized crop here at Montebello. I mean, we had to drop fruit as
Yeah.
normal, do the green harvest, do the post-veraison kind of thinning out, and but we still, in the end, made this an average size production of Montebello.
Yeah.
And it is really made up of Cabernet Sauvignon. This year,
Yeah,
Cab
this is-
was the star of the vineyard.
87%.
87%
And
this
the
year.
Merlot, which is typically 18 to 22%, would be the average
Yeah.
in there, is down to 9%.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it was not a Merlot vintage.
Yeah.
It was a
Yeah,
Cabernet.
Merlot just suffered too much from the difficult
Which is interesting
bloom
because in
and weather.
Bordeaux, in the cooler vintages, that's Merlot that usually
Often,
actually
yeah.
Yeah,
performs.
because it comes in early.
Yeah.
But
But, you know-
Merlot was really set back this year
Mm-hmm.
by the weird spring weather that the vines experienced.
Yeah,
You know,
hard
they
to
bloomed
explain.
slightly behind Cab and didn't really set well, and they were just not enjoying the 2011 growing season.
Well, before we sign off here, what's
Yes,
your
any
what's,
questions or not?
Yeah, we do, but we're out of time.
We're out of time.
So
Okay,
can
sorry.
we say, Paul, what do you like to eat with your Montebello? What's your favorite thing?
I have a preference, just to pick two major dishes, and without going into it, I'm for lamb with Cabernet, with the Bordeaux varieties,
Right.
and I'm with beef for Zinfandel, and of course pasta and everything else.
Sure.
But just to pick those two things that I really feel that with Zinfandel, beef is ideal.
Right.
If you have a good beef dish and you have a glass of Cabernet, glass of Zinfandel, see which one goes well. And with Cabernet, same thing. I personally have a preference for lamb.
Like rack of lamb, some rosemary,
Sure,
and garlic.
absolutely.
There we go.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's that's what made me change from being a vegetarian. That one day, early on, when I joined Ridge, I was a vegetarian.
Did
and-
Kathy do some lamb chops?
Oh, we
or
did
something?
lamb at the winery. It was
Oh, that's
roasting out
right.
there in the front of the winery, drinking 91 Montebello, and that was in the air.
Change your life.
Oh, it did. In a good way. So, yeah, I'm not a vegetarian anymore. And I love lamb with Montebello.
That's
Okay.
it.
Well, thank you very much, Paul.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, Eric. And
It's
thank
great
you
to do
all of you
this.
out there for
Yeah.
joining us this evening. We really appreciate it. We look forward
And
to
we'll
doing
try
this
to
again.
answer some of these questions that we got.
Absolutely. We'll do it
so,
online.
Good.
Okay.
Okay.
Very good. Thank you. Good
Thank
night.
you.
Thanks.